Giselle, Esteban, and Michelle Lay were best friends in high school.
Michelle kind of took her in under her wing.
They are extremely close.
And they remained close in college.
They came up here to go to school together.
But one night in a parking garage, Michelle vanished.
As she walked towards her vehicle, she disappeared.
The circumstances were what we would call suspicious.
As friends and family wonder whether Michelle was still alive.
She was still out there and she needed our help.
Investigators were asking who would cause her harm.
The security guard found what he believed was blood on the tarmac.
And whether a friendship had turned deadly.
This is your last and final warning.
This is a tragic example of frenemies gone horribly wrong.
Hayward, California, May 27, 2011. It was a quiet Friday evening in the hardworking community of 150,000 just across the bay from San Francisco.
Hayward's pretty well known for being kind of a blue-collar town.
Nice working-class neighborhood, hospitals, car dealerships. It's your average community in the East Bay.
But that Friday, a strange mystery was unfolding at one of Hayward's hospitals, the Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. That evening, a 26-year-old nursing student named Michelle Lay was in the middle of a clinical training session at the hospital.
She was going to Samuel Merritt College, and she was supposed to be graduating fairly soon with her nursing degree.
And at around 7 o'clock, during a 15-minute break in the class, Michelle told the instructor that she needed to run out to the parking garage.
She said that she needed to go to her car to get some medication.
But when the 15 minutes were up, Michelle hadn't returned, and her instructor grew concerned.
This was completely out of character for her.
It was very important that she be at the nursing program.
Worried that something might have happened, the instructor went out into the parking garage. But the only sign of Michelle that she found was a brief glimpse of her white Honda driving away.
It was very out of character for Michelle to just wander off.
She was at the last night of her internship, her rotation.
Michelle needed this class to graduate. Worried, the instructor and several of Michelle's fellow students tried to contact her.
People were reaching out to Michelle to find out where she was, why she had left Kaiser.
Michelle did respond to her classmates' frantic calls and texts, but only via text.
They were getting some responses, strange responses.
Hey, I'm heading up to Reno.
Ditching class for a road trip? Michelle's classmates were shocked.
It was an accelerated nursing program. It's not something you could just walk away from and then come back into. You had to stay in the class.
And when Michelle's classmates shared her strange texts with the teacher, she decided to contact hospital security.
Everybody was concerned.
And when the security guard went out to the garage, he made a troubling discovery in the space where Michelle's car had previously been parked.
The security guard found what he believed was blood on the tarmac.
What had happened? Where was Michelle? And was she in danger? By midnight, the police would be asking those questions and more. And the key to answering them would be Michelle's best friend, 27-year-old Giselle Esteban. Born in 1984, Giselle Esteban grew up in San Diego, one of an extended family of Filipino-American immigrants.
Her family was very close-knit.
They'd done well in America, too.
A professional family. They had a lawyer in the family.
Giselle, studious, disciplined, and a bit of a loner, appeared equally destined to succeed in life.
She seemed to be a very hard-minded person.
And by the time she was in high school, the determined teen already had an ambitious goal.
She wanted to go to nursing school.
It was an ambition Giselle shared with her best friend, Michelle Lay. Born the same year as Giselle, Michelle's family had come to San Diego from Vietnam.
They shared the background of growing up in Asian families and coming from an immigrant background.
But while Giselle was quiet and introverted, Michelle was an outgoing girl who made friends easily.
Michelle had a close group of 4 or 5 girlfriends.
The pretty teen had plenty of boyfriends, too.
I always remember her with a guy chasing after her. They all really loved her.
However, while Michelle was popular, she wasn't at all stuck up.
Very loving, very giving person. She seemed to help anybody and everybody that wanted or needed help.
And when she first noticed Giselle sitting alone in the cafeteria at Mount Carmel High,
Michelle kind of took her in under her wing.
From that point on, Giselle and Michelle were close.
They'd be coming over a lot. They would go to the movies together.
And the more time Michelle spent with Giselle, the more it became clear that the two friends enjoyed a special bond.
Michelle was a best friend to her. Sometimes she was her only friend.
They are extremely close. There's absolutely no question about that.
So close that even after graduation in 2002, they appeared destined to be best friends long after high school.
They both moved from San Diego up to San Francisco area to go to college.
They came up here to go to school together.
But while Michelle excelled at San Francisco State University,
Michelle was very successful. She was a very good student.
Giselle's plan to become a nurse started to veer off the tracks. It began sophomore year when Giselle started dating a fellow student named Scott.
Scott is a perfectly nice guy.
And when Giselle introduced him to Michelle, they hit it off too.
Scott and Michelle were really good friends.
The couple dated for the next 2.5 years, but in October of 2005, shortly before Giselle was supposed to graduate, things got complicated.
Giselle and Scott had a child together.
And the fact that she suddenly had a child to raise forced the 21-year-old to put her plans on indefinite hold.
Giselle wanted to go to nursing school, but then had her child really young and couldn't afford to.
She dropped out of school and got a job at a daycare center.
Trying to juggle school and work and things like that, it wasn't working for her.
And if dropping out of school wasn't disappointing enough for Giselle, she and Scott split up in 2008.
They had really their share of ups and downs.
The breakup wasn't the end of their troubles either. They spent the next 3 years squabbling over their daughter.
Giselle and her ex-boyfriend were having problems bringing up their child, so they had been into counseling.
They'd also been in court, fighting over custody of the child, and Scott won the first round.
Scott ended up getting 80% custody of the child.
She was trying to regain some of that back.
And while Giselle was mired in the fallout from her breakup, Michelle was moving on with her life without Giselle.
Michelle was on the successful path of becoming a nurse.
After graduating from San Francisco State, she had enrolled in the nursing program at Samuel Merritt University in Oakland.
She worked part-time as an accountant, but was a full-time nursing student at the same time.
Which meant that by May of 2011, the two teenage girls who'd been so close in high school, the two friends who'd gone on to pursue the same goals, now found their lives going in entirely opposite ways.
Giselle was going in the wrong direction where Michelle was going in the right direction.
But at the end of the month, Michelle's life would go suddenly and unexpectedly off track. During a clinical session at a local hospital, the nurse in training would step out to the parking garage and just disappear. Coming up, the search for the missing woman leads to a shocking discovery.
Once we opened the car up, we were able to see a lot of blood.
And Michelle's family reveals a disturbing secret.
She was having some issues with a stalker.
On the evening of May 27, 2011, the Hayward, California police received an urgent call from staff at the Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. A 26-year-old nursing student named Michelle Lay had just gone missing.
She vanished from a parking garage, and no one knew where she was.
The circumstances were what we would call suspicious.
First, Michelle's instructor and fellow students had tried to contact the missing woman.
She was pretty responsive when they texted her.
But her response, that she ditched class to drive to Reno, only made her friends more concerned.
It was very unnatural for somebody doing this accelerated program to just leave.
Especially someone as serious about her studies as Michelle.
This was very, very out of her character.
And then, when Michelle's instructor contacted hospital security, what the guards found was even more worrying.
In the parking lot where her car was parked, there was perhaps signs of a struggle.
We had some spots of blood where Michelle's car had been.
And if there had been a struggle, that raised a terrifying possibility.
Maybe this was an abduction.
A quick search of the hospital only added weight to the theory.
Michelle's purse was found at the hospital in the break room where she had left it. And her wallet was in there, her driver's license was in there. It was very unnatural for somebody to just leave those belongings behind.
But no matter whether she'd really cut class for a road trip or been kidnapped, one overriding question remained. Where was she now? In hopes of finding her, the police focused their search on her missing car, which, as luck would have it, just happened to be fitted with an anti-theft and recovery device called a LoJack.
They called the company and they requested that the vehicle be tracked. At that time, the LoJack was able to advise of a general location within a block or two of where the car actually was.
And by 9 o'clock on the following morning, patrol units had located the missing car.
Michelle's Honda was found a half-mile from the parking garage.
We found it in a townhouse condominium complex in a parking lot.
The car was empty, and it didn't appear to have been stolen.
The vehicle was locked. There was no windows broken or anything like that.
But once the investigators unlocked the car,
we were able to see a lot of blood.
It appeared to confirm what investigators suspected. Michelle hadn't left on her own accord.
Something terrible had happened inside that garage.
But even as hope for Michelle faded, finding her car did yield one tantalizing clue, an ID badge from Michelle's college.
We found a Samuel Merritt identification card with another person's name on it.
Could it lead to a suspect? The answer appeared to be no.
The person with that access card was currently in Hawaii visiting family.
The ID badge an apparent dead end. The investigators turned the car over to forensics for processing.
Primarily, they needed the DNA evidence from the interior of Michelle's car.
While that work was going on, the investigators spent the rest of that Saturday reaching out to Michelle's family and friends.
To get a feel of who Michelle was.
And to find out if she had any enemies.
You always ask, is there anybody that doesn't get along with the victim?
When they did, one name kept coming up, Giselle Esteban.
Giselle Esteban was a former friend of Michelle.
But the longtime best friends were now on the outs.
Apparently there was bad blood between Giselle and Michelle.
A lot of people mention that. They recall her speaking about it.
None of Michelle's family or friends knew exactly what the bad blood was between the two women, although they suspected it might have something to do with Giselle's ex-boyfriend, Scott, the father of her 5-year-old daughter.
He was good friends with Michelle, so there were all these theories going out there about how Giselle was involved in it.
But was there anything to the theories? The investigators decided it was time to talk to Giselle.
We knocked on the door a little after midnight on Sunday morning, the 29th.
And when the investigators explained why they were there, Giselle didn't appear all that concerned about Michelle's disappearance.
She said, isn't she out partying? And we said, yeah, she could be, but we just wanted to talk to everybody.
Although when they started explaining the details, that Michelle had disappeared from one of her classes at the hospital, Giselle said something that caught the investigators by surprise.
She tells us that she was at the hospital for a OBGYN appointment.
She was pregnant again.
What's more, Giselle said that as she was leaving the medical center, she'd even caught a glimpse of Michelle.
I asked her, did you talk to Michelle? No, I didn't. I saw her on the walkway to the parking structure.
Was it just a coincidence? Or did Giselle know more about Michelle's disappearance than she was letting on? After questioning Giselle at her apartment, they asked her to come down to the station for a more formal interview. And once at the police department, Giselle confirmed that she and Michelle had once been close.
I considered her my sister.
But according to Giselle, that didn't mean she had a clue about what happened.
Since you and Michelle used to be so close, what do you think is going on with her?
I don't know. I don't know who she is anymore.
Something had happened between them that led to a falling out.
Just what? Giselle initially hesitated to say.
She made a mistake. Scott made a mistake.
And when pressed, she confirmed that the rumors were right. The mistake apparently did have something to do with Michelle and Giselle's ex-boyfriend, Scott.
Apparently they've been sleeping together.
What's the nature of your relationship with Scott now?
There is no relationship with Scott.
Although there was some contact, since Giselle and Scott shared custody of their daughter.
He has 80% until July when we have another custody. He only has temporary custody.
Still, even if Giselle and Scott were no longer together, the person she blamed for their breakup had just disappeared.
You realize how that sounds, right?
And when the investigators once again asked if she'd spoken to Michelle that night, Giselle suddenly became non-committal.
Did you have any contact with her?
I don't know. I don't recall.
She did state that she had memory issues because of medication she was not taking because she was approximately 3 months pregnant.
So what medications were you on?
Lithium.
What is your diagnosis? Is it manic depression?
I don't remember what the doctor said.
She claimed that she was tired, exhausted. She had been up for quite some time. We had first contacted her right after midnight. She didn't want to talk to the investigators any further.
Giselle's vague answers and the possibility that she was suffering from mental illness were more than enough to raise the investigators' suspicions. But they were a long way from proof that she had anything to do with Michelle's disappearance.
We didn't have enough to hold her.
So that night, they had little choice but to let Giselle go home. But not before they did two things. The first was to confiscate her shoes on the long shot possibility that she'd also worn them the night Michelle disappeared.
When she had to go to the police department, she asked to put on a pair of shoes. We took those sneakers and had those analyzed.
And the second was to arrange for a team to keep Giselle under surveillance.
We were tasked with following her and her activities.
One of the things that we were looking for to see if she would possibly lead us to a location that we could find Michelle.
Coming up, Giselle's ex-boyfriend offers a different take on their breakup.
He accused her of stalking him.
But was she also stalking Michelle?
She pretended to be interested in joining the nursing program.
By Sunday morning, May 29th, it had been more than 24 hours since 26-year-old Michelle Lay had disappeared from the parking garage of a Hayward, California hospital.
They said there was blood found at the scene of the crime in the parking garage.
So immediately questions arose. Was she the victim of a robbery? Had she been kidnapped by a stranger? Was this someone who she knew? No one had any idea what had happened to Michelle.
No one in the news media, that is. But the police had already identified a potential suspect, 27-year-old Giselle Esteban.
They knew each other from high school.
They had been the best of friends.
Emphasis on had been.
Giselle and Michelle had a falling out a few years before.
And based on what Giselle told the investigators the night before, the reason for their falling out sounded suspiciously like a motive for murder.
She goes, she stole my fiance.
Giselle had also admitted to being at the scene of the crime on the night Michelle disappeared.
She says, oh, I was at the hospital.
The police weren't convinced it was mere coincidence, though.
Giselle was a person of interest reasonably early on.
However, while the investigators took a closer look at Giselle, Michelle's family was focused on one thing: finding their missing loved one.
We did everything in our power to get her face out there and Michelle's name out there.
They started putting out information on Facebook about Michelle missing.
There were yellow ribbons, flyers, t-shirts with missing on them and Michelle's face. They were plastered all over the Bay Area.
The Lay family also offered a reward for any information that would lead them to Michelle.
You'd have those big billboards on the side of the freeway with, missing $65,000 reward.
And on Tuesday, May 31st, 4 days after Michelle disappeared, the massive public outreach drew an unexpected response from Giselle.
Giselle actually contacted a television station to say that she had not done anything to Michelle.
The statement took the media by surprise.
That was the first time her name really came out.
The police weren't sharing any information with the media or with the public at large.
Not even the fact that they considered her a person of interest.
If we let too much information out, first of all, the suspect could take flight. Secondly, they could start destroying evidence that we may not have yet.
But the fact that she hadn't even been named as a suspect didn't stop Giselle from making herself look guilty in the eyes of the public.
She said that she felt that Michelle had played a role in ruining the relationship she had with her child's father. And that's probably the first indication that we had of this possible motive.
Immediately, we wondered, could this be a love triangle?
While the media and the public wondered what to make of Giselle's bizarre statement, Michelle's family remained focused on locating their missing loved one.
We were really honestly feeling like she was still out there and she needed our help.
And desperate to find her, the family sought outside help.
The Class Kids Foundation was founded in the aftermath of my daughter Polly's kidnapping and murder.
They helped us organize all the searches. They trained all of our volunteers.
We have a very viable search and rescue operation.
However, even as the search and rescue operation got underway, the investigators were starting to suspect it was all for nothing.
The Hayward police didn't consider it a missing persons case.
Instead, the obvious grudge Giselle had with Michelle and the blood they'd found in the back of the missing woman's car had led the police to make a grim conclusion.
We suspected there may be a homicide.
So while volunteers combed the hills and canyons outside of town, the Hayward police quietly opened a murder investigation. The investigators started out by reviewing footage from the medical center's extensive network of security cameras.
There was 33 cameras set up in that parking structure.
But when they pulled the footage, they quickly discovered a problem. Several of the cameras had been recently installed and weren't wired into the network yet.
One of which was directly above Michelle's car.
Which meant that if there had been an attack on Michelle in the parking garage, they had no footage of it.
As she walked towards her vehicle, she disappeared out of sight.
But if the cameras couldn't track her, the investigators still had another option.
Michelle's cell phone was missing.
And since someone at least claiming to be Michelle had sent several texts in the hours after her disappearance, pulling her phone records allowed the police to track it.
An incoming message, outgoing message, it sends off a signal to a cell tower.
Tracking Michelle's phone revealed a path that led from the hospital to the parking lot where her car was abandoned, and from there into the hills outside Hayward.
The cell phone tracking that we did is what led to some of the searches that were conducted.
But it was when the police pulled Giselle's phone records that things got really interesting.
We were able to determine that Michelle and Giselle left the parking structure roughly at the same time.
And once again, the investigators didn't think that was a coincidence.
The cell tower hits showed a path for both Michelle and Giselle's phone to the area where Michelle's vehicle was located. We believe at that point, Giselle was driving Michelle's car.
Between the phone records and the fact that Giselle had a long-standing beef with Michelle, the investigators were pretty sure of one thing.
Giselle was going to be our only suspect.
However, they were still a long way from proving that Giselle had anything to do with Michelle's disappearance. And they were no closer to finding Michelle either.
The longer she's gone, the more that your hope gets eaten into.
So while the family continued to search for Michelle,
we never gave up. You can't give up.
The investigators firmed up their case against Giselle, starting with her motive, Michelle's alleged affair with Scott.
It was very clear that Giselle was jealous that Michelle had a relationship with Scott.
However, when the investigators spoke with Scott about the supposed love triangle, they got a surprising answer.
That love triangle didn't exist.
It was a triangle that Giselle created in her head.
Scott maintained all along that the relationship with Michelle was never romantic.
She had another boyfriend.
Scott said that both he and Michelle had repeatedly denied the affair, but that it was no use.
She wasn't going to hear reason from anybody, whether it came from Scott telling her that he has no relationship with Michelle, or Michelle saying that I don't even talk to Scott much anymore. None of that was going to matter.
If you ask Scott, he'll say Giselle was unhappy with her relationship with Scott and she was looking for someone to blame it on.
And according to Scott, once they finally broke up in 2008, he became convinced that Giselle was mentally unstable.
He accused her of stalking him, following him.
Giselle had eventually been diagnosed as manic depressive, and Scott said that her bizarre behavior was not only why he'd won primary custody of their daughter. He said he'd even been forced to file a restraining order against her.
He had filed a restraining order against Giselle. She posed a danger to both him and their child.
And now, the investigators were all but convinced that Giselle had posed a danger to Michelle, too.
The only question was there enough evidence to prove that she did it?
They didn't have a body, but at Samuel Merritt University, where Michelle had been finishing up her nursing degree, the investigators did uncover yet another important clue. When investigators interviewed employees at the university, a secretary told them she'd seen Giselle there the day before Michelle disappeared.
Giselle had gone to the campus.
The secretary told the investigators that she'd spoken to Giselle under what appeared to be innocent circumstances.
She went in there and pretended to be interested in joining the nursing program.
Giselle had named a faculty member that she wanted to talk to. The secretary said, "Oh, she's not in right now. She'll be in at 9 o'clock. So you can come sit in my office until she gets here."
The secretary told the investigators she'd stepped out to do some errands.
When the secretary came back, Giselle said, "Oh, forget my appointment. I'll come back later." And she left.
And according to the secretary, shortly after that was when the college ID badge the investigators found in Michelle's car had turned up missing.
Giselle did that so that she could snag a security badge.
Based on footage from the school's security camera, she had quickly put the stolen security key to use, too.
Later that evening, Giselle came back to the campus and used the electronic key card to gain access to the campus.
Went into the off-limits areas and started rummaging around.
And based on one thing the security cameras revealed.
In her hand, she has a class roster.
The investigators had a pretty good idea just what Giselle had been trying to find.
She had been trying to glean when Michelle was going to be at the hospital.
And if that wasn't enough proof for the prosecutors, the DNA results from the inside of Michelle's car were back from the crime lab by the beginning of September.
We found Giselle's DNA on the signal handle of Michelle's vehicle.
But the real clincher was the results for the shoes Giselle had put on before going to the police station.
We found blood that belonged to Michelle on the bottom of those sneakers.
It was time to make an arrest.
On September 7th, 2011, 3 months after Michelle disappeared, the Hayward Police Department went to Giselle's apartment and placed her under arrest.
No fight, no argument, no nothing. Just puts her hands behind her back.
And despite the fact that Michelle was still missing, the charge was murder.
Can prosecutors file murder charges without a body? The answer is unequivocally yes.
Coming up, the authorities uncover some powerful evidence against Giselle.
This is your last and final warning.
But will they ever find Michelle?
Even at that point, we still had hope.
On October 1st, 2012, Giselle Esteban went on trial for murder. The 28-year-old was charged with killing 26-year-old nursing student Michelle Lay in the parking garage of a Hayward, California hospital.
The police believe that Giselle was lying in wait for Michelle in the parking garage, and that when she saw Michelle walking to her car, that she pounced.
There was a lot of evidence showing that.
So much that the police had arrested Giselle for murder, despite the fact that Michelle was still missing.
This was what we call a no-body homicide.
The district attorney's office believed that there was enough to charge her.
Convicting her was another story, however.
It's much more difficult to get a guilty verdict if you don't have the body.
So 10 days after Giselle's arrest, volunteers had once again combed a remote area where Giselle's cell phone records indicated she'd been on the night Michelle disappeared.
Michelle's family put on a final search for her in the location 20-30 miles from Hayward. A hilly area, a lot of grasslands.
And for the first time, one of the search dogs had appeared to find something.
The dog ran off randomly from the group and came barking back, saying that there was something there.
And when the searchers followed the dog, they discovered that it had found something.
What they described as a makeshift grave.
The remains inside were horribly decayed.
The body was pretty much bones.
But the victims' clothes were still recognizable.
You can tell that they were medical scrubs.
It was a devastating blow for Michelle's family.
Even at that point, we still had hope. It sounds crazy now, but my family and I sat in a hotel room for the next 3 or 5 days waiting for that test result to come back.
DNA tests eventually confirmed that the remains were Michelle's.
That was the worst day.
However, the sad end to the search for Michelle wasn't the only thing that made headlines after Giselle's arrest.
Giselle, sitting in jail accused of murder, was also pregnant.
The baby boy had been born in November of 2011, while Giselle was in jail awaiting trial.
We never found out who the father was of that child.
With Giselle in jail, her parents were raising the baby. But when she sat down at the defense table on the trial's first day, the petite mother of two didn't exactly look like a killer.
People wouldn't perceive this person as being a threat. She was 5'1", maybe 5'2".
However, in his opening statement, the prosecutor told the jury that the harmless-looking young woman in court that morning had coldly, carefully plotted to murder her former friend.
The prosecutors are saying that there was clear signs of premeditation.
It was meticulous. She knew what she was going to do.
And when to do it, thanks to the security badge she'd stolen from Michelle's college.
She used a security badge looking for information about when Michelle's next shift would be.
Information that Giselle had used to stage a deadly ambush, according to the prosecutor.
That he believed that Giselle came up behind Michelle in the garage and attacked her with a knife.
We believe that Michelle was killed there. We have blood spatter on the parking lot floor. We have blood spatter in the front passenger seat of Michelle's car.
And why would Giselle want to murder Michelle? For that, the prosecutors turned to their star witness, Giselle's former boyfriend, Scott. The father of Giselle's first child, Scott testified that their relationship had always been difficult.
They had a relationship that was kind of hot and cold.
But according to Scott, the final break was over Michelle.
Scott maintained a friendship with Michelle, and at some point in there, Giselle got it into her head that there was some kind of affair going on and that they weren't coming clean about this.
An affair that both Scott and Michelle denied.
She had nothing to do with that, and Scott's name never came up in that sense.
Not that their denials were ever enough to convince Giselle.
There was no triangle, but she believed that there was.
It just seems to have eaten at her.
According to Scott, it continued to eat at Giselle well after their breakup.
He said that she was extremely erratic, very angry, very belligerent.
And he claimed to have proof, too. Conversations with Giselle that he'd secretly recorded prior to filing his restraining order.
So it got so bad between them that Scott got a restraining order against Giselle.
The conversation from November of 2010 made it clear that Giselle was still convinced that Scott and Michelle had an affair.
She led you along and you went after it.
What are you talking about?
You slept with her.
I didn't.
On the tape, Scott's denial drew a frightening and revealing response from Giselle.
You will be honest with me regarding her. Otherwise, I will take your life and hers.
So you clearly saw that this was someone that was very disturbed.
Even more disturbing, she'd threatened Scott while their daughter was in the car.
Yeah, honey. What's wrong? Mommy doesn't like being lied to.
And based on what she told Scott, lying to Giselle could be a fatal mistake.
You deserve to die for your lies, as does she. And you will. If you do it again, this is your last and final warning.
In the next recording, a voicemail Giselle left the following month, she threatened to harm herself.
Come get me. Help me. I have a gun in my hand and I don't want to pull the trigger.
She was threatening to kill herself if Scott didn't talk to her.
And in another conversation, when he dropped his daughter off at Giselle's apartment, she appeared desperate to win him back.
You don't love me. Really? You don't love me at all. Not even a little bit anymore.
Giselle, get out of my car, please. I need to go.
In addition to the voicemails and recordings, the prosecutors also presented the jury with a series of text messages that Giselle had sent Scott.
Those text messages offered an insight into what was going on in Giselle's head.
In one, she told Scott, "You pushed me into insanity." In another, she said, "I hope you find what you're looking for in someone as disgusting as her."
She was, using all kinds of foul language, calling Michelle a homewrecker, and her repeatedly telling Scott that he should put a bullet in his own head.
It was just really, really toxic.
And finally, in March of 2011, 3 months before Michelle disappeared, Giselle sent Scott another text. Michelle has dug her own grave. When it was their turn, the defense didn't deny that Michelle was dead because of Giselle.
There was an acknowledgement of her involvement in killing Michelle.
But according to the defense, that didn't make it murder.
Her defense attorney was kind of trying to make this more of a manslaughter thing.
After all, Giselle was manic depressive and off her meds due to the pregnancy. Her texts, voicemails, and verbal threats, clear evidence of a fragile mental state, according to the defense.
It was her own psychosis that directed those thoughts in that direction.
Until on the night of May 27, 2011, Giselle's obsession over Michelle and Scott had simply overwhelmed her.
That she just had this flip out in the garage after a conversation with Michelle and killed her.
Or, in other words,
I think snapped is what her defense attorney was trying to say.
Coming up, will the jury find Giselle guilty of first-degree murder?
Giselle had taken a lot of steps to plan.
Or will they opt for manslaughter?
Were they the same trial as we were?
On October 29, 2012, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the trial of Giselle Esteban. The 28-year-old mother of 2 was charged with murdering her former best friend, Michelle Lay.
This is a tragic example of frenemies gone horribly wrong.
And to the dismay of Michelle's family, deliberations had taken 4 days.
We were thinking, were they the same trial as we were? To us, it should have been open, shut case.
At trial, the defense didn't deny that Giselle had killed Michelle. However, rather than first-degree murder, they had argued for the lesser charge of manslaughter.
Some people say she snapped.
If it's the heat of the passion or whatever, yeah, I think people snap sometimes and do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Michelle's family and the authorities found Giselle's claim outrageous.
I was very angry because the level of premeditation that went in it was crazy.
Especially considering how Giselle had spent days essentially stalking Michelle, going as far as sneaking into her college and swiping her class schedule.
It was clear that Giselle had taken a lot of steps to plan what she was going to do.
But would it be clear to the jury? When the verdict was read, years of anguish and anticipation came down to one moment.
We were just in the front row, holding hands, waiting for them to read the words.
She was found guilty.
When we heard that she is guilty of murder to the first degree, happy is the wrong word, but it was complete relief and a tiny sense of justice.
Giselle's thoughts were harder to read.
When the verdict was read, Giselle showed absolutely no emotion.
Her eyes were just dead.
Or perhaps it was shock. Once Giselle was found guilty, the judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison.
She never gave any kind of sense of remorse or anything like that. And the judge kind of took that all into account.
And if the past is any indication, it's an outcome that Giselle likely blames on Michelle.
For some reason, Giselle had decided that all of the problems that occurred in her life were because of Michelle.
Samuel Little was not the kind of serial killer whose name dominated newspaper headlines for years. There were no nationwide manhunts that stretched across decades. No television broadcasts warning citizens to lock their doors because a predator was on the loose. There was no single city living under the shadow of an unknown murderer. No unmistakable signature that investigators immediately recognized from one crime scene to the next. Instead, his crimes were scattered across the vast geography of the United States. Spread over more than 3 decades, hidden behind forgotten case files, fragmented investigations, and victims whose disappearances often drew little public attention. By the time the full scope of his crimes began to emerge, Samuel Little was already an elderly man sitting behind bars. It was only then that investigators would uncover a truth almost impossible to comprehend. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he had become the most prolific serial killer in American history based on confirmed victims. Little eventually confessed to murdering 93 women between 1970 and 2005. Investigators have since confirmed at least 60 of those murders, while many other confessions continue to be examined against decades-old, unsolved cases. Those numbers alone are staggering. Yet this story is not defined simply by statistics. Behind every number stood a woman with a name, a face, a history, and a life that mattered. The tragedy of Samuel Little is not only that one man was able to kill repeatedly for 35 years. The greater tragedy is that so many of his victims vanished in a silence before anyone realized there was a pattern at all. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. Later in life, he adopted the surname Little, but his early years were marked by instability long before that change of identity. According to his own account, his mother worked as a prostitute and did not raise him. Instead, much of his childhood was spent with his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. Investigators and psychologists who later examined his life noted that his upbringing was deeply unsettled. Although no evidence has ever established that his childhood alone predetermined the crimes he would eventually commit. Countless people endured difficult beginnings without becoming violent offenders. What remains factual is that Samuel Little's early years lacked consistency, and by adolescence he had already begun attracting the attention of law enforcement. Theft, burglary, violence, and repeated encounters with police became recurring features of his youth. In 1961, he was convicted of burglary and served approximately 3 years in prison. After his release, rather than establishing a stable life, he drifted from state to state across America. He worked temporary jobs when work was available, lived a transient lifestyle, and rarely stayed in one location for long. During this period, he also developed skills as an amateur boxer. Years later, investigators would conclude that those boxing abilities played an important role in the way he overpowered many of his victims. His physical strength, combined with experience in striking and controlling opponents, allowed him to subdue women quickly before manually strangling them. Yet none of these pieces seem significant when viewed separately. Across America, Samuel Little was simply another man with a lengthy criminal record, another repeat offender cycling in and out of local jails. He accumulated more than 100 arrests over the course of his life for offenses including theft, robbery, assault, rape, drug-related crimes, and driving under the influence. Time after time, he encountered the criminal justice system. Time after time, he returned to the streets. Looking back, investigators would later describe these repeated encounters as missed opportunities. But during those decades, no one recognized that they were dealing with a man responsible for dozens of murders scattered across nearly 20 states. The reason was painfully simple. Every police department saw only one fragment of a much larger picture. One unidentified body found beside a road in one state. Another woman discovered in an abandoned area hundreds of miles away months or years later. Another death ruled as an overdose or an unexplained tragedy in a completely different jurisdiction. Without modern DNA databases, sophisticated information sharing, or nationwide analytical systems capable of connecting similar crimes, each investigation existed almost entirely on its own. The puzzle pieces remained separated, and no one realized they belonged to the same horrifying image. According to Little's later confessions, the killings began around 1970 in Miami, Florida. From there, they continued for decades. He described searching for women in bars, nightclubs, poor neighborhoods, areas known for prostitution, and places where drug use was common. His victims shared a tragic vulnerability. Many struggled with addiction. Some were homeless. Others survived through prostitution or lived in extreme poverty. Many were socially isolated. A significant number were black women. These characteristics were not accidental. Little himself admitted that he deliberately selected women whom he believed would not immediately be reported missing. During interviews conducted years later, he explained that he targeted people he believed would not be missed. Those words remain among the most disturbing statements associated with the case. Not because they reveal extraordinary cruelty, but because they reflected a painful reality. In far too many cases, the disappearances of marginalized women did not generate urgent investigations. Some victims had no close family members able to report them missing. Others had been living transient lifestyles for years. Some families assumed their loved ones had simply moved elsewhere. Others struggled with addiction themselves or had lost contact long before the murders occurred. As a result, many deaths received only limited investigative attention. In numerous instances, the women were initially believed to have died from drug overdoses, natural causes, accidents, or undetermined circumstances rather than homicide. Samuel Little exploited not only individual vulnerability, but also institutional weakness. He did not need elaborate plans or sophisticated methods to conceal his crimes. He depended upon the fact that his victims often lived on the margins of society. His crimes unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, because society itself frequently failed to notice those who disappeared. This reality would later become one of the central lessons of the entire investigation. The story of Samuel Little is therefore unlike many other serial murder cases. It is not dominated by dramatic police chases, sensational media coverage, or public panic. For decades, there was no nationwide fear because almost no one realized there was a serial killer operating at all. Instead, there were isolated tragedies scattered across the country, each appearing disconnected from the next. A body discovered in one county had no obvious connection to another discovered hundreds of miles away years later. Different investigators worked different cases under different legal systems, often without any reason to suspect that the same offender was responsible. Meanwhile, Samuel Little continued moving from one state to another, carrying with him a history of violence that rarely translated into murder convictions. His extensive criminal record certainly marked him as a dangerous individual, but nothing yet revealed the unimaginable scale of what he had done. That would not happen until decades later, when advances in forensic science, improved information sharing, and the persistence of investigators finally began connecting cases that had remained isolated for generations. The truth would emerge slowly, piece by piece, through DNA evidence, painstaking interviews, and the extraordinary efforts of investigators determined to give names back to women who had long been forgotten. In the chapters ahead, this investigation will move beyond the numbers and into the lives affected by one of America's most extensive serial murder cases. It will examine how Samuel Little selected his victims, why his crimes remained hidden for so long, how investigators finally uncovered the pattern, and why this case ultimately became not only the story of a prolific killer, but also a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences when society overlooks its most vulnerable people. As investigators slowly reconstructed Samuel Little's history, they realized that understanding the man himself explained only part of the story. The far more important question was why so many murders had remained invisible for so long. The answer did not lie in sophisticated criminal planning or advanced forensic knowledge. Instead, it lay in the lives of the women he deliberately chose. Long before his name became known nationwide, dozens of women had already disappeared. Some were found quickly. Others remained unidentified for years. Some would not even be connected to Little until decades later. Their stories shared common threads, not because they knew one another, but because they occupied similar places on the margins of society. According to investigators, Samuel Little consistently targeted women who were especially vulnerable. Many worked as prostitutes. Others struggled with drug addiction. Some were homeless or lived in unstable housing. Many experienced extreme poverty. Others lived socially isolated lives with few people able to notice immediately when they vanished. A significant number of his victims were black women. These were not random circumstances. During later interviews, Little admitted that he deliberately selected women he believed would not be missed. That statement has become one of the defining elements of the case because it exposed not only his method of selecting victims, but also the painful reality that allowed his crimes to continue unchecked. Every victim represented an individual life with personal experiences, relationships, and hopes that were often invisible to the wider public. Many had families, even if contact had become infrequent. Some had children. Others had siblings or parents who continued searching for answers for years. However, unstable living situations often complicated missing person investigations. A woman struggling with addiction might disappear for days or weeks before anyone realized something was wrong. A homeless individual could move between shelters, abandoned buildings, or different neighborhoods without leaving a clear trail. Someone surviving through prostitution frequently met unfamiliar people as part of everyday life, making it difficult to identify the last person who had seen her alive. In many situations, investigators were left with very little evidence beyond a body discovered long after death had occurred. Samuel Little understood these vulnerabilities. According to his own admissions, he searched for women in places where people experiencing hardship often gathered. bars and nightclubs became common starting points because they allowed him to blend into ordinary social settings. Poor neighborhoods, areas associated with prostitution, and locations where illegal drug activity occurred also became places where he encountered future victims. He approached women in a calm, non-threatening manner. Rather than using force immediately, he often relied on conversation and the appearance of friendliness. Some women accepted rides in his vehicle. Others believed they were simply spending time with another person they had recently met. Investigators later concluded that Little rarely needed elaborate deception. His victims often had practical reasons for accepting transportation or companionship, and there was little to distinguish him from countless other men they might meet in similar environments. Once alone with a victim, however, his methods became strikingly consistent. Drawing upon the physical strength developed through amateur boxing, Little frequently struck women with powerful punches intended to stun or disorient them. According to investigative findings based on his confessions, these blows reduced the victim's ability to resist before he manually strangled them. Unlike many serial killers who relied on firearms, knives, ropes, or other weapons, Little almost always used only his hands or forearms. This detail proved critically important because manual strangulation often leaves fewer immediately obvious signs than other forms of homicide, particularly when a victim's body is discovered after significant decomposition. As a result, some deaths were initially interpreted as accidental overdoses, natural deaths, or cases in which the precise cause could not be determined. After the murders, Little typically abandoned the bodies in isolated locations. Vacant lots, roadside areas, abandoned industrial sites, riverbanks, and other remote places became recurring disposal locations. In some instances, victims were discovered relatively quickly. In others, environmental conditions delayed recovery or complicated forensic examination. Every passing day increased the difficulty of determining exactly what had happened. During the 1970s, 1980s, and much of the 1990s, forensic science had not yet reached the level of sophistication available today. DNA databases capable of linking crimes across jurisdictions either did not exist or were still in their infancy. Communication between police departments in different states was also far more limited than modern investigators would consider acceptable. Each law enforcement agency focused primarily on crimes committed within its own jurisdiction. If a woman's body appeared in one county while the suspect had already moved hundreds of miles away, there was often no practical mechanism for recognizing a broader pattern. Samuel Little's transient lifestyle made this problem dramatically worse. Following his release from prison after his burglary conviction, he spent decades moving across the United States. According to the FBI, his crimes ultimately stretched across approximately 19 states. These included California, Florida, Texas, Ohio, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Georgia, and several others. Every relocation effectively reset the investigative landscape. Local officers encountering Little rarely possessed knowledge of incidents occurring hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Even when his criminal history followed him, it primarily reflected offenses such as theft, assault, rape, robbery, drug crimes, or driving under the influence rather than confirmed murders. Consequently, investigators dealing with an individual homicide had little reason to suspect they were confronting a suspect connected to dozens of other deaths nationwide. Another factor that complicated investigations was the enormous volume of criminal activity already confronting local police departments. Homicide detectives frequently worked numerous cases simultaneously with limited personnel and resources. Missing person investigations involving individuals living unstable lifestyles often proved especially difficult. Families sometimes lacked recent photographs. Last known addresses changed frequently. Witnesses could be difficult to locate or reluctant to cooperate. In certain cases, there was uncertainty about whether someone had disappeared voluntarily or become the victim of violence. These realities did not mean investigators ignored victims intentionally. Rather, they reflected structural challenges that Samuel Little repeatedly exploited. Looking back decades later, many investigators described the case as illustrating one of the greatest failures of fragmented law enforcement systems. No single detective ever possessed the complete picture. One officer investigated a woman found beside a roadway. Another handled a suspicious death near an abandoned building in another state years later. A third investigated what initially appeared to be a drug overdose elsewhere. None of these investigators had access to the complete pattern because the murders remained scattered geographically and chronologically across more than 35 years. Meanwhile, Samuel Little continued encountering police for unrelated crimes. Over his lifetime, he accumulated more than 100 arrests. Those arrests involved burglary, theft, assault, rape, robbery, drug offenses, and other criminal conduct. Yet despite his lengthy record, murder convictions never followed. Cases sometimes collapsed because evidence proved insufficient. In other situations, witnesses changed their statements or victims declined to cooperate. Occasionally, prosecutors obtained convictions only for lesser offenses. Every time Little returned to society after serving another sentence, the opportunity to stop the killings slipped away once again. Years later, investigators reviewing his criminal history concluded that several earlier encounters with law enforcement represented missed opportunities that, under different circumstances, might have prevented additional deaths. However, such conclusions emerged only after the complete scale of his crimes became known. During those decades, Samuel Little remained simply another repeat offender passing through America's criminal justice system. No one yet understood that behind the arrests, behind the transient lifestyle, and behind the seemingly disconnected investigations stood a serial killer whose victims were spread across nearly 20 states. That understanding would not begin to emerge until advances in forensic DNA analysis finally connected him directly to murders that had remained unsolved for decades, setting in motion one of the most extraordinary homicide investigations in modern American history. For more than 3 decades, Samuel Little moved through the United States almost unnoticed, carrying with him a pattern of violence that remained hidden beneath countless disconnected investigations. According to his later confessions, the murders began around 1970 in Miami, Florida. From that point forward, the crimes continued across decades, extending into numerous states and leaving behind a trail of victims that no single law enforcement agency could fully recognize. Looking back, investigators discovered that while locations changed, one aspect of Little's behavior remained remarkably consistent. He did not constantly reinvent his methods. Instead, he relied on a routine that worked repeatedly because it exploited both the vulnerability of his victims and the limitations of the investigative systems of the time. Little later explained that he searched for women in places where people experiencing hardship gathered. Bars and nightclubs were common starting points. So were neighborhoods known for prostitution, areas affected by drug activity, and communities struggling with poverty. These environments offered him access to women whose daily lives often required interacting with strangers. For many of them, accepting a conversation or a ride from someone they had just met was not necessarily unusual. Investigators found no evidence that he selected victims because of personal relationships or long-term planning. Instead, he appeared to focus on opportunity, repeatedly choosing women whom he believed would be less likely to generate immediate concern if they disappeared. This pattern remained one of the most chilling aspects of his later admissions. Little openly acknowledged that he believed many of his victims would not be quickly reported missing. The statement reflected not only his own calculated thinking, but also the tragic circumstances surrounding many of the women whose lives he ended. Some struggled with addiction, others lived without stable housing. Some survived through prostitution. Others had become disconnected from family members over time. These realities meant that disappearances were often difficult to distinguish from the instability that already characterized many of their lives. Once Little established contact with a victim, investigators concluded that his attacks followed a consistent sequence. Initially, he presented himself in a manner that appeared non-threatening. There was no indication from the available evidence that he relied upon elaborate disguises or complex deception. Instead, conversation and ordinary social interaction were usually sufficient. Many victims voluntarily accompanied him, believing they were accepting a ride or spending time with someone they had recently met. Only after reaching a more isolated location did the encounter become violent. Little's experience as an amateur boxer played an important role in this phase of the attacks. According to investigative findings and his own confessions, he frequently used powerful punches to stun or disorient his victims before physically overpowering them. Boxing had taught him how to generate force, maintain balance, and control an opponent. Investigators believe these skills allowed him to dominate women quickly, reducing their ability to resist. Unlike offenders who depended upon weapons, Little relied almost entirely on his own physical strength. This choice significantly influenced how many of the murders were initially interpreted. Rather than using firearms, knives, or ligatures, he manually strangled his victims using his hands or forearms. Manual strangulation leaves evidence, but when bodies are discovered after significant decomposition or under difficult environmental conditions, determining homicide can become considerably more complicated. During the decades in which Little committed these crimes, forensic science lacked many of the technologies investigators depend upon today. Consequently, some victims' deaths were initially classified as accidental drug overdoses, natural deaths, or causes that could not be definitively determined. In other cases, the passage of time before discovery meant that crucial forensic evidence had already disappeared. After each killing, Little typically abandoned the victim's body in a location where immediate discovery was unlikely. Vacant lots became recurring disposal sites. Roadside areas offered another opportunity to leave victims in places receiving little regular traffic. Abandoned industrial properties, riverbanks, isolated outdoor spaces, and similar locations also appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. The specific locations varied from case to case, but the overall objective remained consistent, increasing the likelihood that time and exposure would complicate any future investigation. Every day between the murder and the discovery of a body reduced the amount of physical evidence available to investigators. Environmental exposure, animal activity, weather conditions, and decomposition all worked against determining exactly what had occurred. Yet perhaps the greatest protection Samuel Little possessed was not geography or forensic limitations alone. It was movement. Throughout his adult life, he traveled extensively across the United States, rarely remaining in one place for long. According to the FBI, his crimes ultimately stretched across approximately 19 states. Among them were California, Florida, Texas, Ohio, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Georgia, and numerous others. Every relocation complicated the possibility of connecting one investigation to another. A homicide detective working a case in California had little practical reason to suspect that an apparently unrelated death in Mississippi years earlier might involve the same offender. During much of the period in question, police departments primarily maintained their own records. Nationwide information sharing existed in far more limited forms than it does today. DNA databases capable of linking offenders across jurisdictions had not yet become standard. Investigative tools. Digital case management systems were either non-existent or still developing. Detectives relied heavily upon local evidence, witness interviews, and communication within their own agencies. As a result, identical patterns unfolding hundreds of miles apart often remained invisible. Little's lifestyle perfectly exploited those weaknesses. He drifted from state to state, working temporary jobs and frequently changing locations before investigators could associate him with unsolved homicides. Even when he encountered police, those encounters rarely related directly to murder investigations. Instead, his criminal record continued expanding through arrests involving theft, assault, robbery, rape, drug offenses, and other crimes. Over his lifetime, he accumulated more than 100 arrests. Such a record clearly identified him as a habitual offender, but not as a serial murderer. Looking back after his confessions, many investigators regarded these repeated arrests with frustration. Every encounter represented an opportunity that, under different circumstances, might have altered the course of dozens of future investigations. However, at the time, officers had no reason to believe they were interacting with a man responsible for killings committed across nearly 20 states. They saw only the crimes immediately before them. Meanwhile, homicide investigators elsewhere examined isolated deaths that appeared unrelated to anything beyond their own jurisdictions. Another consequence of this fragmentation involved the victims themselves. Many bodies were discovered without immediate identification. Some remained unidentified for years. Others were identified, but investigators lacked witnesses capable of reconstructing the victims' final hours. Because Little often selected women whose lives already involved instability, establishing timelines became exceptionally difficult. Determining who last saw them alive, where they had traveled, or whom they had recently met frequently proved impossible. In some cases, there was little evidence beyond the location where a body was eventually found. Despite these enormous investigative obstacles, one consistent element slowly emerged years later through Little's own admissions. During extensive interviews conducted after his conviction, he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to remember details associated with many of the murders. Investigators were surprised by the precision of his recollections. Even decades after particular crimes, he described cities, roads, weather conditions, clothing, hairstyles, vehicles, and body disposal locations with remarkable consistency. Many of these details had never been released publicly, allowing investigators to compare his statements directly with archived case files. Time after time, important aspects matched documented evidence. This growing body of corroboration would eventually convince the FBI that many of Little's confessions were credible. Yet all of that remained in the future. Throughout the years in which the murders actually occurred, no one possessed enough information to recognize the full pattern. Families searched for loved ones. Detectives pursued isolated investigations with limited resources. Medical examiners reached conclusions based upon the evidence available to them. Each decision appeared reasonable when viewed independently. Only decades later would those individual cases begin fitting together into a single investigation. Unlike any previously seen in American criminal history, the breakthrough would not come from a witness suddenly identifying the killer or from a dramatic arrest at a crime scene. Instead, it would begin with a routine DNA collection after an arrest in 2012, a scientific comparison that linked Samuel Little to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles and opened the door to revealing the true scale of crimes that had remained hidden for more than 35 years. By 2012, Samuel Little was no longer a young man drifting unnoticed across the United States. He was in his 70s, carrying decades of criminal history behind him. Yet the true extent of his violence remained unknown. Law enforcement agencies had encountered him repeatedly throughout his life. His record included arrests for theft, robbery, assault, rape, drug-related offenses, driving under the influence, and numerous other crimes. More than 100 arrests had accumulated over the years, creating the image of a habitual offender who continually cycled through the criminal justice system. Despite this extraordinary history, no murder conviction had ever permanently attached itself to his name. Investigators, working isolated homicide cases across different states, still had no reason to believe that the same man had been quietly leaving victims behind for more than 3 decades. The turning point arrived in 2012, not because investigators had finally connected dozens of cold cases, but because of a routine investigative process that had become increasingly important in modern criminal investigations: DNA analysis. That year, Samuel Little was arrested in Kentucky on a warrant connected to drug-related charges. Following established legal procedures, he was transferred to California. At the time, neither the arrest itself nor the transfer suggested that one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history was about to begin. It appeared to be another chapter in the long criminal record of a repeat offender. Yet one standard procedure would change everything. Authorities collected Samuel Little's DNA and entered it into the national database. This simple act, one performed countless times in criminal investigations across the country, produced results that immediately transformed the direction of the case. The DNA profile matched biological evidence recovered from 3 unsolved murders committed in Los Angeles between 1987 and 1989. For investigators, this was no ordinary forensic success. It represented the first direct scientific evidence linking Samuel Little to homicide. Unlike witness testimony, which can fade over time, or circumstantial evidence that often requires interpretation, DNA provided a powerful and objective connection between the suspect and the victims. The 3 women whose murders became central to this breakthrough were Carol Alford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett. Their cases had remained unsolved for decades despite extensive investigative efforts. Now, advances in forensic science accomplished what had been impossible when the crimes originally occurred. Biological evidence preserved over the years could finally be compared against an offender whose identity had entered the national system. Suddenly, investigators no longer viewed Samuel Little merely as a repeat criminal. They began asking a far more disturbing question. If DNA connected him to 3 murders separated by years, could there be others? As detectives examined Little's history more closely, numerous details began attracting renewed attention. His decades of constant travel across the country, his extensive criminal record involving violence, his pattern of targeting vulnerable women, his frequent movement between jurisdictions. Individually, these facts had once seemed unrelated. Together, they suggested the possibility that investigators were dealing with a serial offender whose crimes had remained hidden within hundreds of unsolved homicide files spread across multiple states. The Los Angeles DNA matches did not immediately prove responsibility for dozens of murders, but they provided investigators with something they had never possessed before: a verified starting point. With those 3 murders scientifically connected to Samuel Little, authorities could begin examining whether similar unsolved cases elsewhere shared common characteristics. Investigators recognized familiar patterns: female victims, vulnerable lifestyles, manual strangulation, bodies abandoned in isolated locations, crimes occurring during periods when Little could be placed in the same general regions. None of these similarities alone proved guilt, but together they justified expanding the investigation far beyond California. In 2014, Samuel Little stood trial for the murders of Carol Alford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett. The proceedings focused specifically on those 3 homicides because they were supported by strong forensic evidence. Unlike many of the cases that would later emerge through confessions, these prosecutions rested upon objective DNA analysis linking Little directly to the victims. The court ultimately found him guilty. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At that moment, many outside observers believed justice had finally been achieved for 3 long unsolved murders. Few realized that the convictions represented only the beginning of a much larger investigation. Even after sentencing, numerous questions remained unanswered. Investigators suspected there might be additional victims, but they lacked definitive proof. Thousands of unsolved homicide cases existed throughout the United States, making it impossible to simply assume responsibility for every similar crime. What authorities needed was information that only the killer himself could provide. That challenge eventually brought Texas Ranger James Holland into the investigation. Holland approached Samuel Little differently than many investigators might have expected. rather than confronting him aggressively with accusations or attempting to force immediate admissions. Holland adopted a patient conversational approach. According to investigative accounts, their discussions often centered on subjects unrelated to homicide. They talked about boxing, a subject Little understood well from his younger years as an amateur fighter. They discussed music, automobiles, memories, and aspects of life that encouraged ordinary conversation rather than defensive responses. Holland understood that obtaining truthful information from an elderly prisoner required patience, rather than confrontation. Over time, this strategy began producing extraordinary results. Little gradually became more willing to discuss his past. Conversations that initially focused on ordinary memories slowly expanded into discussions about women he had encountered decades earlier. Eventually, those discussions became confessions. What followed remains one of the most remarkable series of criminal interviews in modern American investigative history. Across more than 700 hours of interviews, Samuel Little described murder after murder, reaching a total of 93 confessed victims between 1970 and 2005. Such a number naturally raised immediate skepticism. Investigators know that confessions from serial offenders require careful verification because some offenders exaggerate, fabricate, or falsely claim responsibility for notorious crimes. Consequently, law enforcement did not simply accept every statement at face value. Instead, investigators began comparing Little's descriptions with archived case files from jurisdictions across the country. What surprised them was not merely the number of confessions, but the level of detail Little consistently provided. Decades after individual crimes, he recalled cities where murders occurred. He remembered roads leading to disposal sites. He described victims' hairstyles, clothing, vehicles, weather conditions, and physical appearances. Many of these details had never been released publicly. When investigators compared his memories against official reports, numerous elements matched documented evidence with striking accuracy. This process gradually strengthened confidence that many of the confessions were genuine. Little rarely attempted to claim responsibility for famous unsolved murders that had received extensive media attention. Instead, he described lesser-known cases that had remained buried in local archives for years. The specificity of his recollections became one of the strongest indicators supporting their credibility. Nevertheless, investigators remained committed to verifying every confession independently. By the time the FBI completed extensive reviews, authorities had confirmed at least 60 victims through corroborating evidence while continuing to investigate many others. The distinction between 93 confessions and at least 60 confirmed victims remains an important part of the case today. Confirmation requires independent evidence beyond the offender's own statements. In some investigations, that evidence exists through forensic findings, witness accounts, or historical documentation. In others, records have been lost, physical evidence has deteriorated, or the passage of decades has made definitive confirmation impossible. Yet the interviews with James Holland fundamentally changed the understanding of Samuel Little's crimes. What had begun as 3 DNA-supported murder convictions expanded into a nationwide effort to reopen cold cases, identify previously unknown victims, and reconstruct one of the longest serial murder careers ever documented in the United States. The investigation was no longer focused solely on proving Samuel Little's guilt that had already been established in court. The new mission became identifying the women whose lives had disappeared into forgotten files and giving investigators, families, and communities answers that had remained out of reach for decades. Although Samuel Little had already been convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, investigators understood that their work was far from complete. The courtroom proceedings had established his responsibility for the murders of Carol Alford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett through DNA evidence. But the broader investigation had only just begun. The question facing law enforcement was no longer whether Samuel Little had killed. That had already been proven. The far more difficult question was how many lives had actually been lost over the course of his decades of violence, and whether those victims could still be identified after so many years. Answering that question required an extraordinary level of patience. Texas Ranger James Holland became one of the central figures in this effort. Not because he discovered dramatic new forensic evidence, but because he recognized that understanding Samuel Little would require a different investigative approach. Rather than treating every interview as an interrogation focused solely on obtaining immediate admissions, Holland spent countless hours building conversations around subjects that Little willingly discussed. Boxing became one of the most important topics because it connected directly to Little's younger years as an amateur fighter. Music also became a recurring subject, as did automobiles, memories of places he had lived, and ordinary experiences from different periods of his life. These conversations were not distractions from the investigation. They became the foundation upon which trust gradually developed between investigator and prisoner. Over time, Little became increasingly willing to revisit memories from decades earlier. Instead of responding with short denials or refusing to cooperate, he began speaking about women he had encountered throughout the country. The discussion slowly shifted toward crimes that had remained unsolved for years, and eventually toward direct admissions of murder. The interviewing process ultimately stretched beyond 700 hours. Such an amount of time is remarkable by any investigative standard. Rather than relying upon a single confession, investigators accumulated hundreds of hours of recorded conversations that could be carefully analyzed, compared with archived case files, and evaluated alongside existing evidence. During these interviews, Samuel Little claimed responsibility for 93 murders committed between approximately 1970 and 2005. The sheer number immediately demanded caution. Investigators understand that serial offenders sometimes exaggerate their crimes, falsely confess to notorious murders, or provide misleading information for attention or personal satisfaction. Because of this possibility, law enforcement did not simply accept Little's statements as true. Every confession required independent examination. Each claimed victim had to be compared against missing person reports, homicide investigations, autopsy findings, forensic records, and historical evidence collected by agencies across the United States. This painstaking verification process would become one of the largest cold case review efforts associated with a single offender in modern American history. What distinguished Samuel Little from many other convicted serial killers was the extraordinary precision of his memory. Despite his advanced age, he demonstrated an unusual ability to recall visual details associated with crimes that had occurred decades earlier. He remembered cities where he had encountered victims. He described roads leading toward body disposal sites. He recalled weather conditions during particular encounters. He remembered hairstyles, clothing, jewelry, and physical appearances. He described vehicles and locations with a level of specificity that repeatedly surprised investigators. Many of these details had never been released publicly, making them especially valuable during the verification process. When investigators compared his statements against original police reports, numerous details matched information that only someone directly involved would likely have known. This consistency gradually strengthened confidence in many of his confessions. Another remarkable aspect of the investigation involved Samuel Little's ability to draw. During interviews, investigators discovered that he possessed an unusually strong visual memory for faces. Using colored pencils, Little produced dozens of portraits representing women he claimed to have murdered. The drawings included distinctive hairstyles, facial features, hats, earrings, necklaces, and other identifying characteristics that he remembered many years after the crimes occurred. These sketches quickly became one of the most important investigative tools available. Rather than remaining locked away as evidence, the Federal Bureau of Investigation chose to release many of the drawings publicly. The purpose was not to publicize Samuel Little himself, but to identify women whose names had been lost over time. Families, friends, former neighbors, and community members across the country were encouraged to examine the portraits in the hope that someone might recognize a face. In several instances, these efforts helped investigators identify previously unknown victims and reopen cases that had remained unresolved for decades. The sketches served as painful reminders that behind every unidentified victim stood a real person, whose disappearance had left unanswered questions for loved ones. As more cases were examined, the FBI gradually distinguished between confessions and confirmed victims. This distinction remains critically important. Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders, but investigators required independent corroboration before officially attributing each death to him. Confirmation depended upon evidence beyond the confession itself. DNA evidence, forensic findings, witness statements, historical records, crime scene documentation, and other investigative materials all played essential roles. In many instances, investigators successfully matched Little's descriptions with archived evidence, allowing them to officially confirm responsibility. By the time extensive reviews had been completed, at least 60 victims had been confirmed. Numerous additional confessions remained under investigation because evidence had deteriorated, records had been lost, or the passage of time made definitive confirmation impossible. Decades had passed since many of the murders occurred, and in some cases the available physical evidence simply no longer existed. Nevertheless, investigators concluded that many of Little's statements displayed such remarkable consistency with known facts that they considered the overall confession highly credible. Throughout this verification process, another sobering reality became increasingly clear. Many of the victims had originally been overlooked not because investigators lacked concern, but because the circumstances surrounding their lives complicated investigations from the very beginning. Some women had no close family members able to report them missing promptly. Others had experienced homelessness or unstable housing for extended periods. Drug addiction and prostitution often resulted in inconsistent contact with relatives or friends, making disappearances more difficult to recognize immediately. When bodies were eventually discovered, forensic limitations of earlier decades frequently prevented investigators from determining homicide with certainty, particularly in cases involving manual strangulation and advanced decomposition. Samuel Little had deliberately exploited these vulnerabilities. His own admission that he selected women he believed would not be missed reflected a calculated understanding of how easily marginalized individuals could disappear without attracting sustained investigative attention. As investigators reconstructed his movements across approximately 19 states, they also recognized how fragmented law enforcement systems had unintentionally allowed the murders to remain disconnected. Individual police departments investigated isolated homicides within their own jurisdictions. No single agency possessed the complete picture during the years when the crimes were occurring. Only advances in DNA technology, nationwide information sharing, and patient investigative work eventually revealed the broader pattern. Samuel Little remained imprisoned throughout this entire process. He never returned to society after his convictions. On December 30th, 2020, he died at the age of 80 in a hospital within the California prison system due to age-related health problems. His death marked the end of his life, but not the end of the investigation. Even after he was gone, law enforcement agencies continued comparing his confessions with unsolved cases across the country, searching for evidence capable of identifying additional victims and providing long-awaited answers to families. The legacy of the Samuel Little investigation ultimately extends far beyond the crimes themselves. It demonstrated the value of DNA technology in solving decades-old murders. It highlighted the importance of nationwide information sharing through systems such as the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, which assists investigators in recognizing patterns across jurisdictions. Perhaps most importantly, the case forced law enforcement and the public alike to confront uncomfortable questions about whose disappearances receive immediate attention and whose deaths risk being forgotten. Samuel Little's story is therefore not simply the story of one prolific serial killer. It is also the story of dozens of women whose lives mattered, whose identities deserved recognition, and whose cases challenged investigators to look beyond isolated files and see the larger truth hidden within them. Through years of patient investigation, scientific advances, and determined efforts to identify every possible victim, many of those women were finally given names, histories, and a place in the historical record that had been denied to them for far too long. When Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80 in a California prison hospital, there was no possibility that another trial would reveal additional details of his crimes. He had already received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and he never again walked free after his convictions. Yet his death did not bring an immediate end to the investigation. In many respects, it marked the beginning of a different phase, one focused less on the offender himself and more on the victims whose identities and stories still remained incomplete. Even after his passing, investigators across the United States continued reviewing cold case files, comparing decades-old evidence with Little's confessions, and searching for families who had waited years, sometimes generations, for answers. The work became an effort to restore names to women who had too often been remembered only as unidentified victims or forgotten entries in unsolved homicide records. By the time of Little's death, law enforcement authorities had confirmed at least 60 victims out of the 93 murders he had confessed to committing between 1970 and 2005. The difference between those two numbers has often led to questions, but investigators have consistently explained why confirmation is a much higher standard than confession alone. A confession, even one containing remarkable detail, must still be supported by independent evidence before authorities can officially attribute a murder to a particular offender. In some cases, that supporting evidence still exists through preserved forensic material, original investigative reports, witness statements, or other documentation. In many others, however, decades have passed. Physical evidence may have deteriorated or been discarded under older evidence retention policies. Records may have been lost, damaged, or archived in ways that complicate modern review. Witnesses may have died, moved away, or forgotten important details over time. Some victims were never identified when their bodies were discovered, making comparisons especially difficult. These realities mean that not every confession can be conclusively verified, even when investigators believe the information is credible. Despite those limitations, the Samuel Little investigation fundamentally changed how many agencies approached long unsolved homicide cases involving vulnerable victims. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and numerous local law enforcement departments reopened files that had remained inactive for years. Cases involving women who had died by apparent strangulation or whose deaths had originally been classified as accidents. Overdoses, natural causes, or undetermined circumstances received renewed attention. Investigators carefully compared Little's statements about locations, time periods, victim descriptions, and methods with existing evidence. Every possible match required detailed examination. Although not every review resulted in confirmation, many produced new leads that had never previously existed. The investigation demonstrated that even decades-old cases could yield meaningful answers when modern forensic techniques, centralized databases, and coordinated investigative efforts were combined. One of the most significant lessons emerging from the case involved the value of nationwide information sharing. During the years when Samuel Little committed his crimes, police departments primarily investigated homicides within their own jurisdictions. Detectives worked diligently on individual cases, but they often lacked practical methods for identifying patterns extending across multiple states. Little's constant movement through approximately 19 states exploited this limitation. A homicide in California appeared unrelated to another in Mississippi or Florida because investigators had little reason to suspect the same offender was involved. As technology advanced, systems capable of sharing investigative information became increasingly important. Among them was the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, commonly known as VICAP, designed to identify similarities among violent crimes committed in different jurisdictions. VICAP became one of the tools supporting efforts to connect Samuel Little's confessions with historical investigations. By comparing crime characteristics across state lines, investigators gained opportunities that had not existed when many of the murders originally occurred. While no investigative system can completely eliminate the challenges presented by crimes spanning decades and multiple jurisdictions, the Samuel Little investigation illustrated how centralized information sharing can dramatically improve the ability to recognize broader criminal patterns. DNA technology represented another defining element of the case's legacy. Without the routine collection and comparison of Samuel Little's DNA following his 2012 arrest, investigators might never have connected him to the 3 Los Angeles murders involving Carol Alford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett. Those DNA matches became the scientific foundation upon which the larger investigation developed. They transformed Little from a repeat offender with an extensive criminal record into a confirmed murderer whose past demanded comprehensive re-examination. The case therefore stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of how advances in forensic science can reopen investigations that once appeared permanently unsolved. Biological evidence preserved for decades acquired entirely new significance once modern analytical methods became available. Beyond its impact on investigative techniques, the Samuel Little case also prompted broader reflection regarding society's treatment of vulnerable populations. Throughout the investigation, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Little consistently targeted women living under difficult circumstances. Many experienced homelessness, addiction, poverty, prostitution, or social isolation. Many were Black women. These characteristics did not diminish the value of their lives. Yet they often complicated efforts to recognize disappearances quickly or sustain long-term investigations. Some families had lost contact years earlier because of unstable living conditions. Other victims had no immediate relatives able to report them missing. In certain situations, investigators initially believed women had simply moved elsewhere or continued transient lifestyles rather than becoming victims of homicide. Samuel Little understood these realities and deliberately exploited them. His own statement that he selected people he believed would not be missed remains among the most disturbing aspects of the entire investigation because it reflected an awareness of social vulnerabilities rather than random victim selection. The investigation challenged law enforcement agencies, policymakers, and the public to consider how missing person reports, unidentified remains, and homicide investigations involving marginalized individuals are handled. While enormous improvements have occurred in forensic science and information sharing since many of Little's crimes took place, the case continues to serve as a reminder that equal attention must be given to every victim regardless of social status or personal circumstances. No life should become easier to overlook because of poverty, addiction, homelessness, or isolation. Every unidentified victim represents an individual whose family deserves answers, whose history deserves recognition, and whose death deserves careful investigation. Samuel Little's own life ended behind prison walls, but history is unlikely to remember him primarily because of the man he was. Instead, his case is remembered because it exposed profound weaknesses in investigative systems that have since undergone significant change. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, expanding DNA databases, strengthening communication between jurisdictions, and maintaining long-term commitment to unresolved cases. Perhaps even more importantly, it reminded investigators that cold cases are not merely collections of aging documents stored in archives. They represent real people whose stories remain unfinished until every reasonable effort has been made to uncover the truth. Today, Samuel Little remains identified by the FBI as the most prolific serial killer in United States history based on confirmed victims. Yet even that description should not become the central focus of the story. Numbers, while historically significant, cannot fully express the human cost of decades of violence. The figure of 93 confessed murders, or at least 60 confirmed victims, represents dozens of individual lives interrupted, dozens of families left without explanations, and decades during which many women were remembered only through incomplete records or unidentified remains. The greatest legacy of this investigation, therefore, lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the determination of investigators who refuse to let those women remain invisible. Through patient interviews, forensic science, nationwide cooperation, the release of victim sketches, and years of painstaking comparison between confessions and historical evidence, many victims who had once seemed lost to history were finally recognized as individuals rather than anonymous statistics. Their names, their identities, and their stories gradually returned to the historical record where they belonged. In the end, the Samuel Little investigation stands as both a remarkable achievement in modern criminal investigation and a sobering reminder of the consequences when society fails to see its most vulnerable members. It teaches that justice is not measured solely by the conviction of an offender, but also by the willingness to continue searching for the truth long after headlines have faded. For many of Samuel Little's victims, that search began decades too late, but it ultimately ensured that they would no longer remain forgotten. The investigation into Samuel Little became one of the most extensive examinations of cold cases in American history, but at its heart remained a question that could never be answered by statistics alone. Who were the women behind the numbers? For decades, many of them existed only as incomplete entries in police records, unidentified remains, or unsolved homicide files. Their stories were fragmented. Their final moments were often unknown. Their families were left without explanations. The work of investigators after Little's conviction was therefore not simply about confirming the crimes of one offender. It was about reconstructing the lives of the women he had taken and ensuring that they were recognized as victims rather than forgotten names in an archive. The process revealed one of the most difficult realities of investigating crimes that span decades. Solving a case requires more than identifying a perpetrator. It also requires restoring the identity and dignity of those harmed. Samuel Little's ability to recall the faces of his victims became an unexpected and important part of that effort. During his extensive interviews with investigators, Little demonstrated what authorities described as an unusually strong visual memory. Despite the passage of many years, he could remember specific details about the women he claimed to have killed. He recalled hairstyles, facial characteristics, clothing, jewelry, and other features that helped investigators understand who these victims might have been. Using this memory, Little created dozens of drawings of women he identified as victims. The sketches were not works of art created for attention or personal recognition. Their purpose was investigative. Each portrait represented an attempt to provide law enforcement with another possible clue toward identifying someone whose disappearance had remained unresolved. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually released many of these portraits to the public. The decision was based on a simple but powerful idea. Somewhere, someone might recognize the face. A family member might see the drawing and realize it represented a missing relative. A former friend might recognize someone who disappeared decades earlier. A community member might remember a woman whose absence had never been fully explained. The sketches transformed memories from a prison interview room into investigative leads that could reach across the country. This effort reflected a larger change in how authorities approached the Samuel Little case. Instead of viewing the investigation only through the actions of the offender, investigators increasingly focused on the victims and the circumstances that had allowed their cases to remain unresolved. Many of the women had lived difficult lives, but those difficulties did not make them less important. Their struggles with poverty, addiction, homelessness, or unstable circumstances were part of their stories, not reasons for their lives to be overlooked. Each woman had existed beyond the moment when she encountered Samuel Little. She had relationships, experiences, memories, and a place in the lives of others. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was determining which of Little's confessions could be officially connected to documented victims. The number 93 became widely known because that was the number of murders he claimed responsibility for. However, investigators maintained a careful distinction between what Little said and what could be independently proven. This distinction was essential. Criminal investigations depend on evidence, not only statements. Even when an offender provides detailed information, authorities must still verify that the information corresponds with known facts. In Samuel Little's case, investigators compared his descriptions against existing homicide records across multiple states. They examined locations, victim descriptions, dates, circumstances of death, and other details. In many cases, Little provided information that matched details already contained in official files. Sometimes, his statements helped clarify cases that had remained uncertain for years. Other times, his information created new investigative possibilities that required additional work. The process was slow and demanding because many of the crimes had occurred decades earlier. Time had become one of the greatest obstacles facing investigators. Evidence that might have existed during the original investigations was no longer available. People who might have provided information had moved away, lost contact, or died. Records from older cases sometimes lacked the detail available in modern investigations. Every confirmation required careful analysis, and every unresolved confession represented another unanswered question. Yet, even when investigators could not conclusively confirm every confession, they emphasized that Little's cooperation provided unprecedented insight into a large number of previously unsolved cases. The investigation also highlighted the importance of examining older cases with new perspectives. Before Samuel Little's crimes were uncovered, many deaths had been classified based on the evidence available at the time. Some were believed to involve drug overdoses. Others were considered accidents, natural deaths, or cases where the exact cause could not be determined. These conclusions were understandable given the limitations of the period. Investigators in earlier decades did not have access to the same forensic technology, databases, or nationwide communication systems available today. However, the Samuel Little case demonstrated that old conclusions could sometimes change when new information emerged. A case considered closed might still contain unanswered questions. A death once viewed as accidental might require another examination when new evidence appeared. This process of reviewing cold cases became one of the most significant consequences of the investigation. Law enforcement agencies began looking again at unsolved deaths involving women whose circumstances resembled those associated with Little's known victims. The goal was not to force connections where none existed, but to ensure that possible links were not ignored simply because years had passed. The investigation encouraged detectives to look beyond individual cases and search for broader patterns. In many ways, this was the opposite of what had happened during Little's active period. For decades, separate agencies had seen separate tragedies. The later investigation attempted to reunite those pieces into a larger picture. Another important element of the case was the role of technology in supporting human investigation. DNA evidence identified Little's connection to 3 murders and initiated the broader examination of his crimes. Databases helped investigators compare information across jurisdictions. Analytical systems allowed agencies to recognize similarities that might previously have remained hidden. However, technology alone could not solve the case. The breakthroughs depended equally on investigators willing to spend hundreds of hours listening, documenting, comparing, and searching for answers. The combination of forensic science and traditional investigative work ultimately revealed what had remained hidden for decades. Samuel Little's case became a powerful example of how modern investigations increasingly depend on cooperation between different agencies and disciplines. No single police department could have uncovered the full scope of the crimes alone. The murders crossed state boundaries, involved different communities, and occurred during a period when communication between jurisdictions was limited. Only through cooperation between local agencies, federal investigators, forensic specialists, and individuals dedicated to reviewing cold cases could the larger truth emerge. Yet even after the investigations progressed, one reality remained unchanged. No amount of evidence or technology could restore the lives that had been lost. The identification of victims could provide answers, but it could not erase the suffering experienced by families who had waited years for information. It could not undo the fear and uncertainty surrounding unexplained disappearances. It could not return the women whose lives ended because of Samuel Little's actions. That understanding shaped the way many investigators approached the case. Their goal was not simply to document the crimes of one of America's most prolific serial killers. Their goal was to acknowledge the humanity of those he targeted. The women who became victims of Samuel Little were not merely evidence in an investigation. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, and members of communities that felt their absence. The continued effort to identify them represented a commitment to recognizing that every victim deserved attention and justice, regardless of their circumstances in life. The Samuel Little investigation, therefore, became more than a criminal case. It became a reminder of the importance of listening to forgotten voices. The women whose stories emerged after decades had often been overlooked because of social vulnerability. But the investigation demonstrated that being overlooked does not mean being unimportant. Through the persistence of investigators, the use of modern technology, and the willingness to revisit old cases, many victims finally received recognition. Their identities became part of the historical record, and their lives became more than statistics connected to a criminal investigation. The final chapter of the Samuel Little case would not be defined only by the crimes he committed. It would also be defined by the effort to ensure that the women he harmed were remembered. In the years after his conviction and death, the investigation continued to serve as a reminder that justice extends beyond finding the person responsible. True justice also requires remembering those who were lost and refusing to allow their stories to disappear. The Samuel Little investigation left behind a legacy that extended far beyond the conviction of one man. While the crimes themselves represented one of the largest serial murder cases in American history, the investigation also became a detailed examination of how criminal cases are discovered, connected, and resolved across generations. It revealed the extraordinary possibilities of modern forensic science, but it also exposed the consequences of investigative limitations that existed for decades. Most importantly, it forced society to confront an uncomfortable reality. Many of the women who became Samuel Little's victims were overlooked not because their lives lacked value, but because the circumstances surrounding their lives often placed them outside the immediate attention of the systems designed to protect them. The case became a powerful reminder that every missing person represents a human story, and every unsolved death represents someone whose life deserves recognition and justice. When investigators first began connecting Samuel Little to multiple murders, they were not simply uncovering the history of one criminal. They were discovering a pattern that had remained hidden because it was scattered across time, geography, and separate investigative agencies. The murders occurred over approximately 35 years, beginning around 1970 and continuing until 2005 according to Little's confessions. During that period, American law enforcement underwent enormous changes. Technology developed, databases expanded, and investigative methods became more sophisticated. However, many of the crimes attributed to Little occurred before these advances became widely available. Detectives working those original cases were often limited by the information and tools of their era. They investigated the evidence they had, not the evidence that future technology would eventually reveal. This distinction is important because the Samuel Little case was not simply a story of mistakes. It was also a story of changing possibilities. A death investigation from the 1970s or 1980s could not benefit from the same resources available. Decades later, DNA analysis, which eventually connected Little to 3 Los Angeles murders, transformed the investigation in a way that would have been impossible at the time those crimes occurred. The collection and comparison of genetic evidence provided investigators with a link that crossed years and state boundaries. It turned a person with a long criminal history into a confirmed homicide suspect and opened the door to examining a much larger pattern of violence. The case demonstrated how forensic technology could give new life to investigations that had remained unresolved for generations. Yet DNA alone did not reveal the full truth. The discovery of Samuel Little's broader criminal history required human persistence. Investigators needed someone willing to spend enormous amounts of time listening to an offender who had spent decades avoiding accountability. The conversations between Texas Ranger James Holland and Little became one of the defining elements of the investigation. Through more than 700 hours of interviews, investigators gained access to memories that existed nowhere else. The information provided by Little helped create connections between cases that had previously appeared unrelated. His descriptions of victims, locations, and circumstances allowed investigators to compare his statements against old records and determine which claims could be supported by evidence. The process showed that solving cold cases often requires a combination of patience, technology, and careful verification. No single piece of information was enough. DNA created the initial connection. Interviews expanded the investigation. Databases helped compare cases. Historical records provided context. Each element strengthened the others. The investigation became a model of how modern law enforcement can approach crimes that cross decades and jurisdictions. Another major consequence of the Samuel Little case was the increased attention given to unidentified victims and overlooked homicide cases. For many years, some victims had remained unnamed or their deaths had not been fully understood. The release of Little's victim portraits represented a different approach to solving these cases. Instead of focusing only on the offender, investigators turned attention toward the women themselves. The sketches created an opportunity for the public to participate in identification efforts. They offered families and communities a chance to recognize someone who had disappeared long before. The importance of this effort cannot be measured only by the number of cases solved. Even when identification remained impossible, the act of searching carried meaning. It represented a refusal to allow victims to remain anonymous forever. The investigation also changed how law enforcement viewed patterns among vulnerable populations. Before Samuel Little's crimes were fully understood, many homicide investigations involving marginalized individuals faced significant challenges. Victims who lacked stable housing, struggled with addiction, worked in prostitution, or had limited contact with family members could be more difficult to trace. Their disappearances might not immediately generate the same urgency as those involving people with strong social connections and extensive support networks. The Samuel Little case highlighted the danger of allowing those differences to influence the level of attention a victim receives. A person's circumstances do not determine the value of their life. The women targeted by Samuel Little were not defined by the hardships they experienced. They were individuals with personal histories, relationships, and identities beyond the crimes committed against them. The investigation became a reminder that justice must include everyone, especially those whose voices are most easily ignored. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Because Samuel Little traveled extensively, no single department possessed enough information to identify the complete pattern while the crimes were occurring. His activities crossed multiple jurisdictions, creating a situation where separate agencies investigated separate incidents without realizing they were connected. Modern investigative systems, including the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, helped address this challenge by allowing investigators to compare information from different locations and identify similarities. The importance of such systems extends beyond one offender. Many violent crimes involve movement across jurisdictions, and recognizing connections early can prevent future harm. The Samuel Little case showed the consequences of fragmented information and the necessity of continued cooperation among agencies. Despite the progress made, many questions surrounding Samuel Little's crimes remain unanswered. Although investigators confirmed at least 60 victims and considered many of his confessions credible, some cases could never be fully resolved. The passage of time created obstacles that no investigator could completely overcome. Evidence disappeared. Records became incomplete. Witnesses were no longer available. Some victims may never receive the official recognition that their families deserve. This uncertainty represents one of the most painful aspects of the case. Even after one of the most extensive investigations in American criminal history, some stories remain unfinished. However, the effort to identify victims continues to have significance. Every confirmed victim represents a family receiving answers. Every reopened case represents a commitment to remembering someone whose life was once overlooked. The ultimate lesson of the Samuel Little investigation is not simply that one offender committed an extraordinary number of crimes. The deeper lesson is about the importance of attention, persistence, and recognition. The case revealed what can happen when victims are separated by geography, social circumstances, and time. It demonstrated how easily patterns can remain hidden when information is isolated. It also demonstrated how much can be achieved when investigators, technology, and communities work together. Samuel Little died in prison without ever being released, but the investigation surrounding him continues to influence how law enforcement approaches cold cases. It remains a reminder that criminal justice is not only about identifying offenders. It is also about ensuring that victims are remembered and that their stories are not lost. The women affected by Samuel Little's crimes spent decades without answers, but the efforts that followed his conviction helped restore parts of what had been taken from them. Their names, identities, and experiences became central to an investigation that ultimately challenged the nation to look more carefully at those who are often overlooked. In the end, the Samuel Little case stands as both a warning and a lesson. It warns of the devastating consequences when vulnerable people disappear without sufficient attention. It teaches the importance of using every available tool to search for truth, even when years have passed. And above all, it reinforces a simple principle: every victim matters, every life has value, and every unanswered question deserves the commitment required to find the truth. The story of Samuel Little is often described through numbers: 93 confessed murders, at least 60 confirmed victims, approximately 19 states connected to his crimes, and more than 35 years of violence that remained hidden. These figures are significant because they demonstrate the scale of the investigation and the unprecedented nature of the case. However, numbers alone cannot explain the true impact of what happened. Behind every statistic was a person whose life ended violently and a family or community left carrying questions that remained unanswered for years. As investigators continued examining Samuel Little's history, they increasingly recognized that the most important part of the investigation was not the offender himself. It was the responsibility to remember the women who had been forgotten. For decades, many of those women existed only within incomplete records. Some appeared in police reports as unidentified victims. Others were connected to deaths that had never been recognized as murders. Some families continued waiting for information without knowing that their loved ones had become part of one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. The work following Little's conviction represented an effort to correct that absence of recognition. It was an attempt to restore identities, provide answers, and acknowledge that these women deserve the same attention and justice as any other victims of violent crime. One of the most important developments after Samuel Little's confession was the continued review of old cases. Investigators across the country began examining unsolved deaths that shared similarities with the crimes Little described. They looked at cases involving women who had died by strangulation, women whose bodies had been found in isolated locations, and cases where the circumstances of death had remained unclear for decades. The purpose was not to assume that every similar case was connected to Little, but to carefully determine whether his statements could provide answers to investigations that had reached dead ends. This process required patience because many of the cases originated from a completely different era of law enforcement. Investigators had to work with older documents, archived reports, and evidence collected long before modern technology became available. In many cases, the original investigators had already done everything possible with the resources they possessed at the time. The difference was that decades later, new information created new possibilities. Samuel Little's own words became a source of investigative leads that had not existed before. The process of reviewing these cases also emphasized the importance of distinguishing between suspicion and proof. Investigators understood that Samuel Little was responsible for a large number of murders, but they also recognized that every individual case required careful verification. A victim's name could not be officially connected to Little simply because the circumstances appeared similar. Evidence had to support the conclusion. This commitment to accuracy protected the integrity of the investigation and honored the victims by ensuring that their stories were based on truth rather than assumptions. The case also changed the way many people viewed unidentified victims. Before the Samuel Little investigation, some unidentified women remained known only by descriptions associated with where their remains were found or when they were discovered. They were sometimes referred to through case numbers rather than names. The release of victim portraits created another opportunity to change that. The drawings represented an attempt to bring human recognition back into investigations. Instead of seeing victims only as evidence, the portraits encouraged the public to see them as individuals. A face can create a connection that a written description sometimes cannot. A hairstyle, a familiar expression, or a remembered detail might allow someone to recognize a person who had been missing for decades. These efforts reflected a broader principle within criminal investigations. Victims should never disappear twice. The first disappearance occurs when a person is taken from the world through violence. The second occurs when their identity and story fade from public memory. The investigation into Samuel Little worked to prevent that second disappearance. It also encouraged a deeper examination of how society responds to vulnerable populations. Many of Little's victims came from communities where disappearances could be difficult to detect quickly. Some had unstable housing, some struggled with addiction, some worked in environments where frequent contact with strangers was part of daily survival. Some had limited connections with family or friends. These circumstances created challenges for investigators, but they also revealed a painful reality. People who live on the margins of society can sometimes become easier for criminals to target, because their absence may not immediately receive attention. Samuel Little recognized this vulnerability and exploited it. His actions demonstrated how dangerous it can be when a person believes certain individuals will not be searched for or remembered. The investigation challenged that belief by proving the opposite. Every victim matters, regardless of background or circumstance. Another lasting impact of the case involved the relationship between technology and traditional investigative work. DNA evidence provided the breakthrough that first connected Little to murder. Without that scientific development, the full scope of his crimes might never have been discovered. However, DNA alone could not identify all victims or explain decades of criminal activity. The investigation required human judgment, communication, and persistence. Detectives had to listen carefully to statements, compare details, examine records, and work with agencies across the country. The case showed that modern criminal investigations are strongest when technology and human expertise work together. Scientific tools can reveal connections, but investigators are still responsible for understanding those connections and pursuing the truth behind them. The role of information sharing also became a major lesson from the case. Samuel Little's ability to avoid detection for so long was partly connected to the fact that his crimes were separated across different jurisdictions. Each police department saw only a portion of the overall picture. A murder in one state did not immediately appear connected to another murder hundreds of miles away. Systems designed to compare violent crimes across jurisdictions became increasingly important because they allowed investigators to recognize patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. The Samuel Little investigation demonstrated why cooperation between agencies is essential in cases involving offenders who move between communities. Criminal behavior does not always respect geographic boundaries, and investigative efforts must be prepared to do the same. Despite all the progress made, the case continues to represent unanswered questions. Some of Samuel Little's confessions remain unverified. Some victims have not been identified. Some families may never receive the complete answers they hoped for. These unresolved elements are a reminder of the lasting damage caused by crimes committed decades earlier. Time can make investigations more difficult, but it does not erase the importance of seeking the truth. Every additional identification, every confirmed case, and every recovered piece of information represents progress. The work continues because justice does not have an expiration date. Samuel Little himself never publicly transformed into a figure of redemption or regret. His cooperation with investigators provided valuable information, but it did not erase the suffering caused by his actions. The focus of the investigation remained where it belonged, on the victims and the search for truth. Understanding how investigators uncovered his crimes does not mean giving importance to him at the expense of those he harmed. The significance of the case comes from what it revealed about justice, accountability, and the need to recognize people who are often overlooked. In the years following Samuel Little's conviction, his name became associated with one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. But the lasting meaning of the case is not found in the notoriety of the offender. It is found in the determination of investigators who continued searching for answers. It is found in the families who finally received information after years of uncertainty. It is found in the women whose lives were acknowledged after decades of silence. The investigation transformed forgotten cases into remembered stories and unidentified victims into individuals with names and histories. The Samuel Little case remains a difficult chapter in American criminal history, but it also serves as a powerful reminder that justice requires persistence. It requires looking beyond statistics and recognizing the human lives behind them. It requires continuing the search even when years have passed and answers seem impossible. Most importantly, it requires remembering that no victim is insignificant and no life should ever be considered too easily forgotten. The conclusion of the Samuel Little investigation does not arrive with a single dramatic moment. There is no final courtroom revelation, no last confession that answers every question, and no complete list that closes every chapter. Instead, the case remains a continuing examination of truth, memory, and the responsibility to remember those whose lives were taken. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020, inside the California prison system, at the age of 80, after spending his final years incarcerated. His death ended the possibility of further direct interviews, but it did not end the investigation into his crimes or the search for the identities of his victims. The work that followed his conviction demonstrated that a criminal case can continue long after the offender is removed from society. In many ways, the most meaningful part of the investigation, began after Samuel Little himself was no longer the central focus. The attention shifted toward the women whose lives had been interrupted and whose stories had remained incomplete for decades. When the full scale of Samuel Little's crimes became known, the immediate reaction centered on the extraordinary number of victims. The FBI identified him as the most prolific serial killer in United States history based on confirmed victims. His confession of 93 murders shocked investigators and the public. At least 60 victims were eventually confirmed, while additional cases continued to be examined. However, the significance of the investigation cannot be measured only through numbers. Each confirmed victim represented an individual human being whose existence extended far beyond the circumstances of their death. They were not simply names connected to an investigation. They were women with personal histories, relationships, memories, and futures that were taken from them. One of the most important lessons from the case is that victims should never become secondary figures in the story of a criminal. The actions of Samuel Little created the investigation, but the lives of the women he harmed gave it meaning. Throughout the years that followed his conviction, investigators continued working to identify victims and connect his confessions with documented evidence. This process required careful examination because the passage of time created enormous challenges. Some evidence had been lost. Some records were incomplete. Some witnesses were no longer available. Some victims had never been identified at all. Yet investigators continued because each unanswered case represented a person whose story remained unfinished. The effort demonstrated that even when a crime is decades old, the search for truth remains valuable. The case also changed the way many people viewed cold cases involving vulnerable victims. For years, some of Samuel Little's victims existed within circumstances that made their disappearances difficult to investigate. Many were women living with poverty, addiction, homelessness, or social isolation. Some had limited contact with family members. Some lived in environments where frequent movement and uncertainty were part of daily life. These realities created challenges for investigators and made it easier for disappearances to remain unnoticed. Samuel Little understood these vulnerabilities and selected victims whom he believed would receive less attention if they vanished. That belief became one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation because it revealed not only the actions of one offender, but also the risks faced by people who are already marginalized. The investigation challenged society to recognize that vulnerability should never determine the value placed on a person's life. A missing person is not less important because they are poor. A victim is not less deserving of justice because they lived a difficult life. The Samuel Little case became a reminder that the purpose of justice is to protect everyone, especially those who may have fewer resources or fewer people able to speak on their behalf. The case also represented a major development in the use of modern investigative methods. DNA technology provided the first critical breakthrough when Samuel Little was linked to 3 Los Angeles murders through forensic evidence. Without that discovery, the larger investigation might never have occurred. The case demonstrated how scientific advancements can transform investigations that once appeared impossible to solve. Evidence preserved for decades can become meaningful when technology advances. A case that once lacked answers can eventually reveal the truth. However, the investigation also proved that technology alone is not enough. The discovery of Samuel Little's crimes required investigators willing to spend hundreds of hours examining information, asking questions, and verifying details. The interviews conducted by Texas Ranger James Holland demonstrated the importance of patience in criminal investigations. Through extensive conversations, investigators obtained information that allowed them to examine cases across the country. The combination of forensic science and investigative persistence revealed the full scope of crimes that had remained hidden for decades. Another important legacy of the case was the increased awareness of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Samuel Little's movements across approximately 19 states allowed him to remain undetected. Because different agencies often viewed individual crimes separately, a homicide investigation in one state did not automatically connect with another investigation. Hundreds or thousands of miles away, the development and use of systems designed to share information across jurisdictions became essential in identifying patterns. The investigation showed that criminals who move between communities require investigative responses that can do the same. Cooperation between local departments, federal agencies, forensic specialists, and analysts became a central part of uncovering the truth. The case remains a powerful example of why criminal investigations cannot exist within isolated boundaries. Information must be shared, patterns must be recognized, and every possible connection must be examined. Despite the achievements of the investigation, some uncertainty remains. Not every confession has been independently confirmed. Some victims may never be identified. Some families may never receive the complete answers they hoped for. This reality represents one of the most painful aspects of the case. The passage of time creates obstacles that even dedicated investigators cannot always overcome. Yet uncertainty does not mean the effort was meaningless. Every confirmed victim represents a family receiving recognition. Every reopened case represents progress. Every name restored represents a person who is no longer forgotten. The investigation continues to demonstrate that justice is not only about reaching a final conclusion. It is also about refusing to stop searching. The story of Samuel Little also raises important questions about how society remembers crime. Serial killers often become known because of the scale of their actions. But focusing only on the offender can unintentionally overshadow the victims. The historical importance of the Samuel Little case should not come from the identity of the man who committed the crimes alone. It should come from what the investigation revealed about the women whose lives were lost and the systems that failed to recognize the connections earlier. The case is a reminder that criminal history is not only made by offenders. It is also shaped by victims, investigators, families, and communities searching for answers. Today, Samuel Little's name remains associated with one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. But the ultimate meaning of the case extends beyond the person responsible for the crimes. It represents the importance of forensic science, the value of investigative cooperation, and the necessity of paying attention to people whose circumstances make them easier to overlook. It represents the determination of law enforcement officials who continued searching through decades-old records. It represents families who refused to stop hoping for answers. Most importantly, it represents the women whose stories were finally brought into the light. The Samuel Little investigation serves as both a warning and a lesson. It warns of the devastating consequences that can occur when vulnerable people are ignored. It teaches the importance of using every available resource to uncover the truth. It reminds investigators and society that time should never be the reason a victim is forgotten. Behind every case file is a person. Behind every statistic is a life. Behind every unanswered question is someone who deserves to be remembered. The legacy of Samuel Little will forever be connected to tragedy. But the legacy of the investigation belongs to the pursuit of justice. It belongs to the effort to restore identities, uncover hidden truths, and ensure that the women whose lives were taken are remembered not as numbers, but as human beings. Their stories became known because people continued searching, and their memory remains the most important part of this entire case.